What you're about to hear is a story that will make you question everyone you trust. It's about how the people closest to us can become our greatest enemies, and how betrayal often wears the mask of love. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a man who thought he knew his family until he discovered the truth. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, building the kind of life my immigrant parents could only dream of. But this story isn't about my success. It's about how my own brother systematically destroyed everything my father built, right under my nose. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in my corner office at a tech startup, debugging code that had been giving me nightmares for weeks, when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed my brother David's name. "Marcus, we need to talk." David's voice was strained, urgent. "It's about Dad's will." Our father, William Chen, had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. He'd been the pillar of our family, a man who'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. Through sheer determination, he'd built Chen Electronics from a small repair shop into a multi-million-dollar electronics distribution company. "What about the will?" I asked, minimizing the code window on my screen. "There's been a mistake," David said. "A big one. Can you come to the house tonight? We need to go through some documents." I should have known something was wrong right then. David had never been interested in the family business. While I was studying computer science, he was partying his way through a communications degree. While I was working 16-hour days to establish my career, he was jumping from job to job, never staying anywhere longer than a year. But he was still my brother. And family comes first. That's what Dad always taught us. That evening, I drove to our childhood home in Fremont, California. The house sat on 2 acres of prime real estate, purchased by my father in 1995 when the area was still affordable. It was a testament to his success, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool in the backyard. David met me at the door, looking haggard. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit was wrinkled. He'd always been the handsome one, the charming one. At 32, he could still make people believe anything he said. "Thanks for coming," he said, leading me to Dad's study. "I've been going through the legal documents, and there's something you need to see." The study looked exactly as it had when Dad was alive. His massive oak desk dominated the room, surrounded by bookshelves filled with business journals and family photos. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the air. David pulled out a thick folder from the desk drawer. "Here's the problem," he said, spreading documents across the desktop. "Dad's will. It's not what we thought." I picked up the papers and began reading. According to the document, our father had left the entire business to David, along with 60% of his personal assets. I was listed as receiving only the house and 40% of the remaining assets. "This can't be right," I said, scanning the pages again. "Dad always said the business would be split between us." "I know," David said, his voice heavy with what sounded like regret. "But look at the date. This was signed just 2 weeks before he died. He must have changed his mind." I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked like Dad's handwriting, but something felt off. The signature was shakier than usual, which made sense given his condition near the end. But the date. Why would he make such a drastic change without telling me? "Did he say anything to you about this?" I asked. David shook his head. "Nothing. I'm just as shocked as you are. But Marcus, I want you to know, I don't want this to come between us. The business, we can work something out. Maybe you could join as a partner or something." I should have been suspicious. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I felt grateful that my brother was being so reasonable about an unreasonable situation. "Let me think about it," I said, folding the documents. "This is a lot to process." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I contacted Dad's attorney, Richard Huang, who confirmed that the will was legitimate and had been properly executed. I spoke with the witnesses who had signed the document, both employees from Chen Electronics, who said Dad had seemed lucid and determined when he made the changes. Everything checked out, but something still nagged at me. My father had been a methodical man, someone who planned every detail of his life. It didn't make sense that he would make such a significant change without at least discussing it with me. Meanwhile, David was busy taking control of the company. He moved into Dad's office and began implementing changes immediately. He hired new staff, updated the company's branding, and started pursuing different suppliers. Some of the long-term employees seemed uncomfortable with the changes, but David assured them it was all part of his vision for the company's future. 3 months after Dad's death, I decided to accept David's offer to join the business as a partner. I was tired of the corporate world, and the idea of continuing our father's legacy appealed to me. David seemed genuinely happy when I told him my decision. "This is perfect," he said, shaking my hand across the desk that had once been our father's. "We'll make this company bigger than Dad ever imagined." But as I settled into my new role, I began to notice things that didn't add up. Financial records showed significant expenditures that weren't reflected in the company's operations. Inventory was being moved to locations I'd never heard of, and several of our biggest clients had suddenly terminated their contracts, citing management concerns. When I asked David about these issues, he always had explanations. The expenditures were investments in new technology. The inventory moves were part of a strategic reorganization. The lost clients were just casualties of the transition. We'd win them back eventually. But the explanations felt rehearsed, too smooth. And David's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He'd disappear for hours during the workday, claiming he was meeting with potential partners. He'd take phone calls in private, speaking in hushed tones and hanging up quickly when I entered the room. 6 months into my partnership, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was working late one evening, trying to reconcile some financial discrepancies, when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on David's desk. As I bent down to pick them up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath the scattered documents was a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letterhead read Morrison and Associates, and the date was from 2 months before Dad's death. I glanced around the empty office, then picked up the letter and began reading. "Dear Mr. Chen, thank you for consulting with our firm regarding the estate planning matter you discussed. As per our conversation, we have prepared the documentation necessary to execute your father's revised will. Please note that the witnesses we discussed are prepared to provide testimony regarding your father's mental state at the time of signing, should any challenges arise. We look forward to finalizing this matter and ensuring your inheritance is properly secured. Sincerely, James Morrison, S.K." My hands were shaking as I read the letter a second time. The implications were staggering. David had consulted with a different law firm about Dad's will. He had arranged for witnesses to testify about Dad's mental state. This wasn't a legitimate change to the will. It was a conspiracy. I quickly took a photo of the letter with my phone and carefully placed it back where I'd found it. Then I sat in the dark office, my mind racing with questions. How had David done this? Who else was involved? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father's final weeks, how weak he'd been, how dependent on others for even basic tasks. It would have been easy for David to manipulate him, to convince him to sign documents without fully understanding what they were. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the office of Richard Huang, the attorney who had supposedly handled Dad's will. I needed to see the original documents to understand exactly what had happened. Richard was a small, elderly man who had been my father's lawyer for over 20 years. He greeted me warmly, expressing his condolences again and asking how I was adjusting to the changes. "Actually, that's why I'm here," I said, sitting across from his desk. "I have some questions about Dad's will." Richard nodded, pulling out a thick file. "Of course. What would you like to know?" The changes he made near the end. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? Richard opened the file and began recounting the events. According to his records, my father had called him 2 weeks before his death, requesting an urgent meeting to revise his will. When Richard arrived at the house, Dad was lucid, but clearly weakened by his illness. He said he wanted to ensure the business would be in good hands, Richard explained. He felt that David had shown more interest in the day-to-day operations and would be better suited to run the company. But David was never involved in the business, I protested. He barely visited the office. Richard looked surprised. Really? Because your father specifically mentioned that David had been helping him with various business matters during his illness. He said David had been instrumental in maintaining client relationships and managing the staff. This was news to me. During Dad's final months, I had been the one handling business issues, coordinating with the management team, and ensuring continuity. David had been notably absent from these responsibilities. Can I see the original will? I asked. Richard hesitated. I'm afraid I can't share the original document without proper authorization, but I can tell you that everything was properly executed. Your father signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, and his mental competency was confirmed by his attending physician. Who were the witnesses? Let me check. Richard flipped through the pages. Janet Morrison and Michael Torres. Both are employees at Chen Electronics. I recognized Michael Torres. He was one of our warehouse supervisors. But Janet Morrison was unfamiliar to me, despite supposedly being an employee. Can you describe Janet Morrison? I asked. Richard frowned, clearly trying to recall. Middle-aged woman, I believe. She seemed to know your father well. I left Richard's office more confused than ever. Janet Morrison didn't work for Chen Electronics. I was certain of that. And Michael Torres, while loyal to the company, was exactly the kind of employee David could easily manipulate. That afternoon, I drove to the warehouse and found Michael Torres organizing inventory. He was a quiet man in his 50s who had worked for my father for over a decade. Michael, I said, approaching him casually, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm trying to understand what happened when Dad changed his will. I know you were one of the witnesses. Michael's expression immediately became uncomfortable. He glanced around nervously before speaking. Mr. Chen, I'm not sure I should be talking about this. It's okay, I assured him. I'm just trying to understand Dad's thinking near the end. Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Look, your brother David. He said your father wanted to keep the will change quiet. He said it was important that you didn't know until after, you know. But you were there when Dad signed it? Well, not exactly, Michael admitted. David brought me the document to sign as a witness. He said your father had already signed it, but needed official witnesses for the legal requirements. My stomach dropped. So, you didn't actually see Dad sign the will? No, sir. David said your father was too weak to have people in the room, but the signature was definitely his. I thanked Michael and left, my mind reeling. David had forged the will, using manipulated witnesses who never actually saw Dad sign the document. But proving it would be another matter entirely. That evening, I returned to the office after hours. I needed to find more evidence, something that would definitively prove David's deception. I started with his computer, but it was password protected. Then I turned to his desk, methodically searching through every drawer and file. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath some old business cards, I found what I was looking for. A USB drive labeled Insurance. When I plugged it into my laptop, I discovered a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. The drive contained multiple draft versions of Dad's will, showing how David had experimented with different distributions of assets. There were email communications with James Morrison, the attorney who had helped orchestrate the fraud. Most damning of all, there was a recording of a phone conversation between David and someone named Janet Morrison, apparently James Morrison's wife, who had posed as a company employee to serve as a witness. In the recording, David's voice was clear and calculating. "The old man trusts me completely. He'll sign anything I put in front of him. The key is making sure Marcus doesn't suspect anything until it's too late." I sat in the dark office, listening to my brother's betrayal play out in his own words. The man I had trusted, the family member I had defended, had been planning to steal our father's legacy all along. But the evidence on the USB drive revealed something even more disturbing. David hadn't just forged the will, he had been systematically looting the company's assets. The mysterious expenditures I'd noticed were actually transfers to offshore accounts in David's name. The inventory that had been moved was being sold to competitors at below-market prices, with David pocketing the difference. Over the past 6 months, he had stolen nearly $3 million from Chen Electronics. The company our father had spent decades building was being gutted from the inside. I copied all the evidence to my own drive and began planning my next move. I couldn't confront David directly. He would just deny everything and probably destroy the evidence. I needed to be smart about this, to build an airtight case that would not only expose his fraud, but also ensure he faced serious consequences. The next morning, I called in sick again and drove to the office of Sandra Martinez, a criminal defense attorney who had been recommended by a friend. Sandra was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. "This is a complex case," she said, after reviewing the evidence I'd brought. "We're looking at multiple felonies: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and elder abuse. But the evidence you've gathered is excellent. Your brother was incredibly sloppy." "What's our next step?" I asked. "We need to involve law enforcement immediately. This level of financial fraud requires criminal prosecution. I'll also help you file a civil suit to recover the stolen assets and restore your father's original will." That afternoon, Sandra and I met with Detective Ray Sullivan from the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Detective Sullivan was a veteran investigator who had handled numerous white-collar crime cases. "Your brother made a critical mistake," Detective Sullivan explained after reviewing the evidence. "He kept detailed records of his crimes. This USB drive is essentially a confession. We'll need to move quickly to freeze his assets and prevent further theft." Over the next week, Detective Sullivan worked with federal agents to build a comprehensive case against David. They discovered that the offshore accounts contained over $4 million, not just money stolen from the company, but also funds that David had embezzled from Dad's personal accounts during his final illness. The investigation revealed the full scope of David's betrayal. He had been planning the theft for over 2 years, gradually gaining Dad's trust and positioning himself as the primary caretaker. He had used Dad's illness as an opportunity to isolate him from other family members and business associates. Most heartbreaking of all, the investigators found evidence that David had been withholding Dad's pain medication, using his suffering as leverage to gain compliance with financial decisions. My father had died in more pain than necessary because his own son was using his medication as a tool of manipulation. 8 days after I first discovered the evidence, federal agents arrested David at the Chen Electronics office. I watched from across the street as they led him away in handcuffs, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The arrest made headlines in the local business community. "Son charged with embezzling millions from family business" was the headline in the San Francisco Chronicle. The story detailed how David had forged his father's will and stolen from the company, destroying a legacy that had taken decades to build. But the legal victory was just the beginning of a long recovery process. Chen Electronics was in shambles, with clients fleeing and employees uncertain about their futures. I had to make a choice: try to rebuild the company my father had created, or let it die with his reputation. I chose to fight. Working with a team of financial forensics experts, I began the process of recovering the stolen assets. The offshore accounts were frozen, and most of the money was eventually returned to the company. I also had to rebuild relationships with clients who had lost trust in the Chen name. It took 2 years, but Chen Electronics eventually recovered. We implemented new financial controls and brought in professional management to ensure nothing like this could happen again. The company is now more successful than ever, employing over 200 people and serving clients throughout the West Coast. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for his crimes. He also faces additional charges in civil court, where I'm seeking damages for the emotional distress and business losses his actions caused. I've only seen him once since his arrest, during the sentencing hearing. He looked broken, a shadow of the confident man who had once charmed everyone he met. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine remorse. But it was too late for remorse. The damage was done, not just to the business or to our family's reputation, but to the memory of our father. David had betrayed not just me, but the man who had given him everything. The hardest part wasn't the financial loss or the legal battles. It was accepting that the brother I had loved and trusted had been capable of such calculated cruelty. He had looked into our dying father's eyes and seen only an opportunity for personal gain. Some people have asked me if I'll ever forgive David. The honest answer is that I don't know. Forgiveness is a process, and I'm still working through the anger and hurt. What I do know is that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean allowing someone to escape the consequences of their actions. Today, I run Chen Electronics with a philosophy my father would have approved of: trust, but verify. I've learned that even family members can become enemies when money is involved. I've learned that loyalty must be earned, not assumed. But I've also learned that honor and integrity are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. My father built his legacy on hard work and honesty. David tried to destroy that legacy through greed and betrayal. In the end, the values my father taught me proved stronger than the corruption David embraced. Chen Electronics continues to thrive, now managed by people who understand that success built on deception is no success at all. We've established a scholarship fund in my father's name, helping young immigrants pursue their American dreams just as he did. As for David, he'll be eligible for parole in 8 years. I don't know what kind of man he'll be when he gets out, or whether he'll have learned anything from his time in prison. What I do know is that the brother I once trusted is gone, replaced by a stranger who valued money more than family. The Chen family legacy lives on, but it's forever changed by the betrayal of one man who forgot that true wealth comes not from what you take, but from what you build for others. Sometimes I sit in my father's old study, now converted into a conference room at the company headquarters, and I think about the lessons he taught me. He always said that character is revealed not by success, but by how you handle adversity. David's character was revealed when he chose to steal from his own family. Mine was revealed when I chose to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The inheritance trap David set for me ultimately caught him instead. Justice, as my father used to say, has a way of finding those who run from it. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just the betrayal of one family member, but the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully planned deceptions. Evil may win for a time, but it cannot sustain itself forever. The Chen family name has been restored, not through forgiveness or forgetting, but through the courage to confront difficult truths and fight for what's right. That's the legacy my father truly left me. Not a business or a fortune, but the strength to stand up for justice, even when it means standing against family. In the quiet moments when I miss my father most, I remember his words: "A man's true wealth is measured not by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for those he loves." David sacrificed our family for money. I sacrificed my trust in family for truth. In the end, only one of those sacrifices had meaning. The inheritance trap was real, but it wasn't the one David thought he was setting. It was the trap of his own making, built from lies and greed, that ultimately destroyed him. The truth, as difficult as it was to uncover, set me free. That's the real lesson of this story. Not that family will always betray you, but that truth will always triumph over deception if you have the courage to seek it out and the strength to act on it. Chen Electronics stands today as a testament to that truth and to the memory of a man who believed that integrity was worth more than gold. David tried to steal our father's legacy, but he couldn't steal the values that created it. Those values live on in every employee who works for the company, in every client who trusts us with their business, and in every person who learns that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth the struggle. The inheritance trap is real, but the truth is stronger, and sometimes that's all the justice a family needs.